Charged. That's the word that matters here. A former United States Air Force pilot, someone who once flew for the country he's now accused of helping a strategic rival study, is facing federal charges for allegedly giving China's military the kind of expertise the law says should never leave American hands. Prosecutors allege he provided what the law calls defense services to the Chinese military, and they're prosecuting it as a violation of the statutes that control who gets access to America's military know-how. He has been arrested. He has not been convicted of anything, and under the law, he is presumed innocent unless a court says otherwise. But the questions this case raises go beyond one person's guilt or innocence. Why would a former American combat pilot end up on the wrong side of an arms control law? What exactly counts as defense services, and why does handing that expertise to Beijing get treated with the same seriousness as handing over a weapon? And why does the Justice Department say this is part of something larger than one arrest? Stick with this one. By the end, you'll know what the government says he did, what the law he's accused of breaking actually protects, why officials treat cases like this as a real national security threat and not paperwork, and what still isn't public yet. In a case this fresh, what hasn't been confirmed matters just as much as what has. Start with what's actually been reported. The Justice Department says a former U.S. Air Force pilot has been arrested and charged with providing defense services to the Chinese military. That phrase, providing defense services, isn't casual language. It's a specific legal term, and it sits at the center of the case, so it's worth slowing down on. Under U.S. arms export law, defense services doesn't just mean handing someone a piece of equipment. The rules, built around the Arms Export Control Act and enforced through the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, which the State Department administers, cover furnishing assistance, including training, to a foreign person or a foreign military in the design, development, operation, maintenance, or employment of defense articles. In plain terms, if you teach a foreign military how to use, fly, maintain, or fight with something the United States controls, that instruction can itself be treated as a controlled export, just as regulated as physically shipping a fighter jet part overseas. You don't have to hand over hardware to break this law. Knowledge alone can be the violation, and that appears to be exactly the theory prosecutors are working from here. The case is being prosecuted as an alleged violation of U.S. arms export control laws, the framework built to keep sensitive military expertise from reaching countries the United States treats as strategic competitors or adversaries. China is explicitly one of those countries under current U.S. policy, which is part of why a charge like this draws federal, not local, attention. Violations under this statute are serious federal crimes, carrying the possibility of significant prison time on conviction, which says something about how seriously Congress built this framework to be enforced, even before you get to the facts of any one case. Here's where the story gets bigger than one defendant. Prosecutors say this isn't an isolated incident. The Justice Department has described the case as part of a broader effort to stop former American service members from selling their military expertise to foreign adversaries. That single sentence changes the shape of the story. It's not one pilot, one bad decision. The government is telling you this is a pattern they're actively hunting for, which means they believe more than one person has tried it, and that there's an ongoing enforcement effort built specifically to catch it before or after it happens. I spent time looking into how these arms export cases typically get built, and one thing kept standing out. They almost never start with a tip about money changing hands. They start with a paper trail, a border crossing that doesn't match a stated purpose, a wire transfer routed through an odd intermediary, a visa application, a job posting on an overseas recruitment site that doesn't quite add up once you read the fine print. Investigators building export control cases are usually working backward from a transaction or a communication, piecing together intent over months, sometimes years, before an arrest ever happens. That's the unglamorous, slow-moving reality behind a headline that reads like it happened in one dramatic moment. It didn't. Cases like this get built, not caught. For a while, that patient, paper trail approach is the whole story. Quiet document requests, financial records, months where nothing seems to move. But that patience exists for a reason. Somewhere in that slow accumulation of records is usually the detail that turns a suspicion into a chargeable case, and figuring out what that detail was here is part of what the coming court filings should reveal. So why would a former fighter or transport pilot end up allegedly training a foreign military the United States considers a strategic rival? Honestly, this isn't new, and it isn't unique to the U.S. Air Force. In recent years, Western defense officials in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia have all publicly warned about a specific recruitment pattern. Private companies, often based overseas, offering large sums of money to former military pilots to train foreign air forces, sometimes without making clear whose military is actually on the receiving end of that training. In one widely reported case, a former U.S. Marine Corps pilot named Daniel Duggan was indicted in the United States and later extradited from Australia on charges connected to training Chinese military pilots years after leaving the service. That's a different person, a different case, a different set of facts. It's mentioned here only as public context for how this kind of alleged conduct has played out before, not as evidence about the pilot in this story, whose case stands on its own. Which brings us to the real question underneath this case. If the recruitment pattern is publicly known, if officials have been warning about it for years, why does it keep allegedly happening? The answer isn't simple ignorance. First obstacle, and it's structural. Enforcement here is genuinely hard. Export control law depends on proving intent and proving what specific information or training crossed a line, not just that a former service member had contact with a foreign government or company. A retired pilot giving a general aviation safety lecture overseas is legal. That same pilot walking a foreign military through tactics, weapons, employment, or operational techniques tied to U.S. defense systems is not. That line can be narrow, and prosecutors have to build a case precise enough to survive a courtroom, not just an accusation precise enough to make headlines. Part of why the Justice Department leans on cross-agency task forces, including a joint Justice Department and Commerce Department effort focused specifically on protecting sensitive technology from adversary nations, is to coordinate this kind of investigation across agencies instead of leaving it to a single office. Second obstacle, information itself is a moving target in cases like this. What counts as sensitive tied to one aircraft platform can be public knowledge tied to another. Prosecutors and defense attorneys in export control cases fight over exactly this. Whether the training or knowledge in question was genuinely export-controlled, or was, as the defense often argues, general aviation knowledge freely available in open civilian sources. That distinction can decide the whole case, and it's rarely settled quickly. Expect pretrial motions, expert testimony on what's actually classified or controlled, and a timeline that, in similar past cases, has stretched well over a year before anything reaches trial. Here's what strikes me about this case, stepping back from the legal mechanics for a second. This isn't really a story about one pilot's choices. It's a story about what happens when expertise itself becomes a strategic asset, when the thing being protected isn't a physical object you can put behind a fence, but knowledge sitting inside a person's head. You can guard a runway. You can classify a document. It's much harder to guard what someone learned over a 20-year career once they've left the uniform behind. That's the uncomfortable gap this category of law is trying to close, and it's a gap that gets harder to close every year as more countries compete for the same small pool of people who've flown advanced military aircraft. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The money reportedly on the table in these recruitment schemes is substantial enough that framing this purely as one person's moral failure misses half the picture. If a foreign broker offers a former military pilot several times a service member's annual salary for a training contract dressed up to look like ordinary civilian aviation work, that's not just a test of individual character. It's a system with a wide-open financial loophole, and the people best positioned to walk through it are the very people the country spent years and public money training in the first place. That doesn't excuse allegedly breaking the law. It does mean the fix probably isn't only prosecute harder after the fact. It's also close the recruitment pipeline before anyone signs a contract. What do you think? Should a former service member ever be allowed to sell specialized military training to a foreign government once they've left the service, even a friendly one? Or is a lifetime restriction the only way to actually close this gap? That's a genuinely open question, and reasonable people land in different places on it. The legal framework is clear enough on paper. Whether it can actually outpace a determined recruiter with a large enough paycheck is a much messier question. And that question is exactly where this case is now headed, into a courtroom, where the government has to prove every one of these details rather than simply allege them. One detail stuck with me while reading through how these cases usually unfold. The gap between arrest and trial is often where the public loses interest, right when the actual facts are being established. The arrest happens fast and gets the attention. The part that determines whether the allegations hold up happens slowly, in filings most people never read. There's also a piece of this we couldn't independently verify before publishing this video. the exact timeline of when the alleged training took place, and how investigators first connected this pilot to it. If primary court documents on this become public and you come across them, drop what you find in the comments below. We read them. It's worth understanding what happens next, mechanically, because it explains why a case like this can feel like it goes quiet for a while after the initial arrest makes headlines. A federal charge like this typically moves through an initial appearance before a magistrate judge, a decision on bail or detention, and, depending on how the case was filed, either a grand jury indictment or a preliminary hearing before it ever reaches trial. Each step generates its own court filings, and each filing tends to reveal a little more of the government's actual evidence than the original charging document did. That's usually where the real specifics, the who, the when, the how much, start to surface publicly, often months after the arrest itself stopped being news anywhere else. It's also worth putting this single case inside the bigger trend the Justice Department keeps pointing to. Export control and national security prosecutions tied to China have become a growing category of federal cases in recent years, spanning far more than aviation. Trade secrets, semiconductor technology, and dual-use research have all shown up in similar charges. The government's own public statements describe a coordinated push across agencies to identify and prosecute this kind of activity before sensitive expertise leaves the country, rather than only after the fact. Whether that push is working, or whether cases like this one are the exception that makes headlines while most attempts go undetected, is genuinely unresolved, and it's a fair question to ask every time a case like this surfaces. So here's where the case actually stands right now, as best as the public record shows. The former Air Force pilot has been arrested and charged. The Justice Department is prosecuting the case as an alleged arms export control violation tied to defense services allegedly provided to China's military, and officials describe it as part of a wider effort to stop former American service members from selling their expertise to foreign adversaries. No verdict exists. No conviction exists. Under the law, and in this video, he is presumed innocent, and the specific facts prosecutors will need to prove in court. Exactly what training was allegedly given, when, and to whom inside the Chinese military, haven't been fully detailed in public reporting as of this video. What's genuinely not known yet, and shouldn't be guessed at, the pilot's full service history beyond former U.S., Air Force, the precise timeline of the alleged training, any specific dollar amounts or contracts involved, and exactly how the case first came to investigators' attention. Those details, once they surface through court filings, will matter enormously to understanding what actually happened here, and they're exactly the kind of details worth checking directly against primary sources rather than taking secondhand from any single report, including this one. If cases like this interest you, the quiet legal fight over who gets to sell American military expertise and to whom, that's a thread running through several recent Justice Department national security prosecutions. By every indication, this won't be the last case like it.